We want China to play a more positive role in this conflict. They may be watching Russia right now because they may not mind the West getting a bit of a beating. They may not mind moving into a bigger position vis-a-vis Russia. They used to be the little brother, now they're kind of the bigger brother. But I do think President Xi is the one person who could really influence President Putin to pull his troops out.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are talking to Dr. Karin Von Hippel, the Director General of the think tank RUSI. Karin joined RUSI in 2015 after serving in a number of senior positions for 6 years during the Obama administration. She has direct experience in more than 20 conflict zones. Great to speak to you today, Karin. We're going to talk about a wide range of issues, but let's start with the thing that's heading the news today, which is the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, has powered his way by armored train to meet Vladimir Putin in Russia. How badly do these two need each other?
It's starting to look like a very bad, war satire film with the evil dictators. It's almost like a Peter Sellers film or something. It's very interesting. I think that the Russians obviously want to be careful that it doesn't look like they need the North Koreans too much, because they realize that isn't good imagery for this powerful military nation, the way they see themselves. On the other hand, they obviously need some support from North Korea, whether that's missiles or other. I don't quite know. We don't quite know what it is. And of course, the North Koreans always need know-how and support from other countries that are not the West, because they're so isolated. So it's hard to say. But you listen to some retired Russian generals who would say, "Oh, we barely need the North Koreans, and maybe we need a tweak or two, but it's nothing." It's nothing major.
And as we're speaking actually right now, there is no announcement on any arms deal. But North Korea has expertise in things like military satellites, nuclear submarines, long-range ballistic missiles.
Correct. Yeah.
There's a lot for Russia to be interested in here. How dangerous could a strengthened alliance between these two be?
I don't think it's going to be significant. I think it's an optic thing more than anything else, that the optics don't look good on Russia's side, and I think they're aware of that. But they certainly do need, as you say, missile technology and ammunition or whatever it is that the North Koreans might provide. But I think they will. It's really hard to say. I think they also want to just let the West know that watch it, because the North Koreans have nuclear capability and we're close to them. And so just be careful with us. I think that's what the Russians often send that message. That's a message Putin sends quite often. I shouldn't say the Russians, because really a lot of this is Putin himself.
And on that watch it message from Putin, the top of the Times website right now, there is a story that President Putin took this opportunity ahead of this meeting to claim that Britain has trained and coordinated Ukrainian troops to attack a Russian nuclear plant, an attack that they've thwarted. But he's suggesting Russia could be provoked into a counterattack on a similar Ukrainian facility. What do you make of all that?
Again, the Russians, or Putin, really does have a record of accusing others of something that he has done or is thinking about doing or is about to do. The problem during war, though, is all sides let out information. They plan what information they let out. And so you don't always know what's true. You don't always know what's true when our governments tell us what's going on, and we don't always know what's true on their side. But we do know that Putin has a long history of misinformation and of exaggerating activity. And so it's very hard to take this. We need to hear more from the Brits. We need to hear what the Ukrainians say in response to this. But it could easily be another false flag operation.
Let's talk about the G20 summit in New Delhi this year. It was strikingly different in the communique compared to last year's. There was no universal condemnation of the war in Ukraine, no mention of Russia, but instead this universal mention to refrain from action against the territorial integrity and sovereignty or political independence of any state. Why the mood change?
Well, don't forget that President Xi and President Putin were not there in person. They sent deputies basically to attend. Putin, for obvious reasons, he doesn't want to be arrested. At the same time, everyone knew it would be very difficult to get a joint statement when you have to have Russia, in a sense, sign off on it, China sign off on it, and even India, which has tried to play a bit of a neutral role in this war. It has a deep relationship with Russia over many years. India was trying to play it quite carefully, and so in some senses, I think the Americans were quite happy with the communique. I think the Brits and other Europeans were happy because it did say, we do not interfere in the territorial integrity of other countries. It reinforced some of the planks of the United Nations Charter. But of course, it didn't call Russia out by name. But I think that was the expectation. And, at the end of the day, how important is a communique from a G20 meeting? In a sense, it's better that at least countries are talking. It gave Biden the opportunity, without Xi and Putin there, to try to, push the case that has been made by the West about this war.
But on that point about being happy about the statement about not interfering in sovereignty of a country, I mean, if you've got Russia saying we've annexed Crimea, it's Russian, then it all depends on your definition of that.
Of course, and the Russians are also thinking, well, this means that if the Ukrainians bomb inside Russia, they're interfering with our territorial integrity. So they can interpret it any way they want. I mean, the Russians are masters of twisting and turning information, declaring black as white and white as black. I mean, there's no other country that's as good as the Russians are with misinformation, with propaganda, with twisting facts. So it's actually quite impressive.
Ukraine's response to that communique was that this was nothing to be proud of. Yet it's being celebrated in Russia by the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. It's a Kremlin win, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned the reasons why India might be trying to play this kind of peacemaker type role. How successful could that possibly be?
I think the Americans saw it as not necessarily a win, but they were content with it because they felt they got their message through as much as you can with these kind of communiques. I mean, Modi, as I said, he has been certainly in some senses more supportive of Russians than Western countries want him to be. But at the same time, don't forget last September at the Gulf Cooperation Council meeting in Uzbekistan, he publicly said now was not the time for war. And Putin acknowledged that both Russia and both India and China had pushed back on him at that time. I don't think they've done enough to push Russia to withdraw. And so, when you talk about what does peace mean in Ukraine, it means different things to different countries.
I mean, the Brazilian president also, Lula, he's remained neutral. He even suggested that President Putin wouldn't be arrested if he travelled to the next G20 in Brazil. He's rowed back on that now, saying that it's for the courts to decide. But there does seem to be further evidence that there's far from unanimous condemnation of President Putin. Are they kind of trying to leave the door open, perhaps, for him to climb down at some stage while retaining his self-pride?
I don't know if that's what this is about. I mean, don't forget, after the war, after the Russians invaded Ukraine in late February last year, I guess it was last year, and then in early March, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution. They did it at the UN General Assembly because they knew they couldn't get it through the Security Council. 141 countries agreed that, with the condemnation of Russian aggression into Ukraine. 35 abstained, 5 said no. 5 were the usual: Eritrea, North Korea, Belarus, etc. But 35 actually abstained on a declaration that basically said we're condemning aggression by one country into another. 1 year later, the same group voted, and I think it was 32 abstained. So 1 got off the fence and voted against Russia, and 2 actually joined Mali and I can't remember the other country. So there are a number of countries that are playing this, trying to play this game where, in their view, they feel like this is a Western conflict. This is a white person's conflict. You hear that. What about the conflicts in our part of the world? This isn't our issue. There's a lot of hypocrisy in the West, and some of that is true. And so I think that they're asserting themselves in different ways now, and they are saying you can't take our support for granted anymore. Now, the middle or the bigger countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, and some of those countries, even the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and others that are also doing the same playing both sides, they are saying you can't tell us who we can choose to partner with or not. We are going to choose to work with Russia or China, and we are also going to choose to work with you. And so it's quite complicated now. I think it's just we're in a more multipolar, much more complex and more uncertain world than we were beforehand. And I think the war in Ukraine has brought a number of these issues and pressures to light that maybe people weren't aware of before.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that because only last month we had the BRICS summit,
Correct.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and they invited new members. Do you think this is a direct challenge to the liberal rules-based order that we're witnessing at the moment? And you mentioned this multipolar world that's developing. I mean,
Correct.
is the world getting more dangerous?
It's getting more complicated. I do think it is a direct challenge. I think that's the right question. I think so there's two ways to look at it. One of them is we're tired of the West dictating all the rules, and we have to join and try to maneuver our way around in these Western institutions, the UN, the IMF, World Bank. At the same time, the Chinese and other countries have been pushing new organizations. So the BRICS is hoping to welcome, I think, 11 countries come January. They already have half the world's population. Now, they're not very effective right now, but it just is a warning signal not to take all of these countries for granted. And at the same time, if you look at Western institutions, they were built for a different era. I mean, in so many ways, the UN isn't functioning in the way that it should. I mean, I am a fan of the UN. I've worked for the UN, but I'm also deeply disappointed in many aspects of the UN because it isn't able to bring the sum of its parts are not more than actually the individual members right now because, the Security Council is stymied. There are a number of its institutions that have a lot of trouble. And so I do think we need to be thinking about all of these institutions, whether it's BRICS or traditional organizations, and thinking through how to make them more inclusive. Now, I know the Americans are worried about this because they've just tried to get more money for the World Bank, for example, so they can compete with some of these Chinese-funded reconstruction banks that the Chinese have established, for example.
So if this is a warning to the West and more specifically also to the UN, how do you think they should respond to it?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, the Americans are already responding by trying to figure out ways of offering more money. I think the European Union is trying to do similar things. I think they're talking about, making more loans available, et cetera, to developing countries. And the developing countries, I think, are, in a way, they're hedging their bets. And maybe that's the way it'll be going forward. They're not going to fully ever align with China or the United States. If you take that great political competition at the global level, they will pick and choose. And it may be that we're in a situation going forward where, depending on the subject matter, different countries come together to solve a problem. So it may be that you don't need these permanent institutions, that you work with, ad hoc organizations like the counter-ISIL coalition that I worked on under the Obama administration. 80 countries came together for a purpose. There were kinetic and non-kinetic working groups dealing with misinformation or terror financing, foreign fighters. And once the threat has passed, you don't really need such a big institution anymore, and it can kind of just dissipate. So maybe we're the world is just changing, and it takes everyone a while to realize what's going on.
And what about the UN? You mentioned that you were disappointed in the way that it has reacted.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you can't blame the Secretary General or the Secretariat or whatever, but they have not been able to, bring their good offices to bear to end very many conflicts. I mean, I worked on Syria, in the Obama administration, and even getting humanitarian aid into Syria was very difficult. You could not get a resolution passed in the Security Council because the Russians or the Chinese would typically block it. Mostly the Russians, but sometimes the Chinese even. And so if you can't even get a resolution about humanitarian assistance through the Security Council, then there needs to be another consideration. And there are countries like India, which, by the way, is now the most populous country in the world, that is not a permanent member of the Security Council. So, in that sense, the world has changed and the UN has not caught up. Now it's all, you start talking about Security Council reform and people want to slit their wrists because it's just such a horrible, debate about it. There's so many, well, this happens, this has to happen. And it's very, very difficult. And so what are countries doing? They're creating different institutions to solve their needs. And that's maybe what, where the world's going. It's a bit too early to say.
And if the situation is, as you portray it, like these shifting sort of tectonic kind of geopolitical plates at the moment, you throw into the mix the presidential elections in the US next year. Russia will have elections as well. I mean, there could be very different personalities in power in the very near future.
Yeah, unlikely in Russia that we're going to have a different
Yeah.
personality and power, but you never know, right?
Mm.
The United States, I think part of the reason, if we go back to the Ukraine war, I think part of the reason there's so much pressure on the Ukrainians right now to make progress in the very near future is because they're worried as well that if a Republican candidate, whether it's Donald Trump or DeSantis or another, comes in, many of them have been quite skeptical of U.S. support for Ukraine. Now, there's bipartisan consensus in the Senate to support Ukraine, but the president may not be of the same mindset. And so there is a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians. They don't have a lot of time. And, they're wearing themselves out as well. I mean, it's incredibly difficult. They've lost so many people. So much of their infrastructure has been destroyed. And so they also realize that, they're going to get, I mean, they for all sorts of reasons, they want to end this sooner rather than later.
Mm. And on that subject, the head of the US Army, General Mark Milley, he said the counteroffensive was progressing at a steady pace, but that there's 30 to 45 days worth of fighting weather left. Former US generals that we've spoken to on Frontline, I mean, they've often expressed their frustration at the slow decision-making process in the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Did it have to be that slow?
It's a great question, and a lot of people have said this. It's easier with the benefit of hindsight, right, to come to this conclusion. I think at the very beginning, everyone was very worried about Russia doing something quite dramatic. And so you recall in the early days, we will only supply defensive weapons, not offensive weapons. And, of course, that distinction disappeared very quickly because in a sense, it wasn't a true distinction. But the more that the West has pushed in the types of weapons that they supplied and how they supply it, the more they realize they could do more. And so, yes, it has been too slow. The Ukrainians also need to learn how to use a lot of the equipment, and not all of it is equipment that they're used to. They've been incredibly resilient, incredibly fast learners, super innovative in their own mix of technology and, sort of no-tech weapons mixed with high-tech drones and civilians sending information and all of that. So it's been incredibly impressive what they've been able to do with what they have. But certainly, yes, an accelerated supply of military support would really make, I think, a difference. And I think there's less worry now about Russia or Putin doing something quite dramatic, like using a tactical nuclear weapon. And I think, by the way, we have China to thank for that. I think President Xi has been the one who has quietly pushed Putin to stop using that type of language.
Now, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, Lieutenant General Budanov, he said on Saturday that the fighting will continue one way or another. So they seems to be in it for the long haul.
Well, that's
Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, Ukraine is certainly determined to fight, even if this means a long war. Does the US have the capacity, or perhaps more importantly, the will to support Ukraine, do you think, through a protracted conflict?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I do know that if there is some sort of agreement and armistice, I suspect this war is not going to end with a decisive blow. I suspect somehow the Russians and the Ukrainians could be convinced to stop fighting, and there's some sort of line that's drawn in the sand. Both sides will probably continue with low-level responses for some time, like has happened over the last, really since they invaded Crimea in 2014. And so I think the only insurance Ukrainians could have is they join the EU, which will help them root out their own corruption, help them, strengthen their institutions, and they get some sort of security guarantee from NATO, whether that's full membership or something else. If they get that, if they get both of those, which both of them are, they're on the cards, it's not clear what it means in practice, then I think the Russians would think twice about another invasion. So it might freeze the conflict. It might be 20 or 30 years till Ukraine is able to get back all of its territory, if at all. But some sort of agreement has to come into place. Otherwise, as you say, it could just drag on for years and years and just really destroy an entire generation, entire country.
I mean, Ukraine has always been clear to fight a long war. It needs US support. What do you think they need to prove to turn Western support into a success?
Well, I just think it's similar to what you mentioned earlier. They just need increased support and probably delivered much more quickly than has been the case. It's difficult because countries are running out of ammunition. They don't have a lot of, the stocks are being depleted, right? And so there are a lot of conversations behind the scenes about how to do this, or conversations about how they're fighting. Is this the right way to fight? Are there other ways to fight? Sometimes the messaging we get when we read what's in the public domain is messaging that they are intending to set out, whether the Ukrainians want people to think they're weaker or stronger than they are.
But what do you think? So, what do you think they need to actually show to prove that they are succeeding?
They need some sort of breakthrough with this counteroffensive, some sort of military breakthrough, push back the Russians out of at least some of the territory in the east and in the south, not just inch by inch, slowly. I don't think that is what anybody wants. Of course, not the Ukrainians as well.
You mentioned earlier that we had China to thank in some of its influence in this war. It's often been said that China is watching what happens in Ukraine before determining how it wants to proceed over its claims over Taiwan. Right now, there's a lot of focus on Britain because of the allegations and the threats that China, even whether to use the word threat relating to China, because of the allegations of spies entering the heart of Westminster. I'm just wondering, how do you think the relationship should be handled with China?
The world is too complicated. China is too integrated into our economies, too important of a partner for a black and white solution. And so it is going to be complicated how all of our countries, whether it's the US, UK, the EU, manage this policy of theirs, which is we will work with China when we can, whether that's on North Korea or climate change. We will push back on unfair trade practices, and we will also push back and call them out for human rights abuses. It's complicated, this partner, competitor, rival policy that our countries now have. But it goes back to the earlier conversation we had. The world's more complex, it's more confusing. And I don't think you can just say, you're a threat, we're not going to work with you anymore. It just wouldn't work. And it's not really the right approach either. It's just a much more complicated relationship going forward. And by the way, we want to be able to call China an ally. We want China to play a more positive role in this conflict. They may be watching Russia right now because they may not mind the West getting a bit of a beating. They may not mind moving into a bigger position vis-a-vis Russia. They used to be the little brother, now they're kind of the bigger brother. But I do think President Xi is the one person who could really influence President Putin to pull his troops out. I don't think anyone else can at the global level. And it's too bad that he's not pushing hard now to make that happen.
How do you think he would convince President Putin to do that?
I don't know. He's probably the only person Putin listens to. But yeah.
Not Kim Jong-un, though.
I don't think it's going to happen in the near future, but it is, it really is potentially one way to finish this war.
You work very close to Westminster yourself as the Director General of a well-known, respected think tank dealing with global security and defence issues and assessments. How seriously do you have to take the security of your organisation from espionage?
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's a huge challenge for us too. We have all sorts of layers of cybersecurity. We have, concerns about this all the time, about whether it's, the physical security of our building, whether it's, whether, someone could come in with a bomb, whether somebody might plant a bug in our building. We worry about it all the time. We are on Whitehall, right? We are in the heart of government. And so in some ways we're in a better place because there's a lot of security around here. But at the same time, we're definitely a target. Many of us individually have been targeted, and our institution has been targeted too.
Have you been targeted personally?
Of course, yeah. Most people have. I'm sure you'd be too. I'm sure, the Times is targeted quite frequently. Most places are targeted frequently every single day, right?
Yeah. I was just kind of curious because I remember I spoke to a former Director General of RUSI who told me they used to get followed around by people, like almost old-fashioned kind of twitching papers.
I haven't seen that. I don't think that's necessary anymore, right? There's so much you can do by just getting into somebody's telephone, getting into their computer system. So there's a lot more you can do now without having to physically follow people around. I haven't noticed anyone following me around, but...
I'm just interested to know also, finally, what RUSI will be concentrating on in the coming weeks and months, both in Ukraine and further afield. What's your focus of
Well,
attention?
certainly the Ukraine war, whether it's from a tactical military um, uh, analysis, or the geopolitics, or the financial integrity of Ukraine post-war. We're following a range of issues related to the Ukraine conflict, and of course, a spillover at the global level, as we've discussed earlier. At the same time, we're doing a lot of work on the whole advanced technology arms race. What does that mean for countries? How do you improve your chances of succeeding in the space, competing with China? How do you measure success in this space? But then we're also working on all the other stuff that we work on, whether it's nuclear conflict or what's going on in Africa with all these coups that have been happening over the last few months, looking at South America. So there are a range of issues. We do geopolitics, we do defense, and we do security. And so it's really a range from counterterrorism through to nuclear war.
Karen, you've just booked yourself about another 20 Frontline interviews to cover all those subjects.
Yeah, right. Well, maybe not me.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.